Hi, thank you so much for joining your morning or afternoon or evening. Welcome to our third conversation in a new series on keywords in the psychosocial. I'm Hannah Zevin, and the founding editor of Parapraxis magazine and the co-director of the Psychosocial Foundation with Alex Colston, who's also in the Zoom. And we're hosted today by these two new groups, Parapraxis, which is a new popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, first issue on the family problem coming out this fall, and the Psychosocial Foundation, which is a nonprofit educational organization that exists to advance our understanding of where the social, political, and psychological converge. I'm going to turn things over to Jane Hugh momentarily, who will be moderating today, but I first want to welcome you all and encourage you to check out the other offerings of the foundation, our seminars. The next one will be on reparations in the psychosocial. The current one is on the family problem, and the next lecture in this series. So to that end, this is the link to our website, which has all of our information. So I'll just say quickly, the next keyword in the psychosocial is the clinic. That will be on November 12th. We will have Francisco Gonzalez, Camille Robsi, and Anki Mukherjee, who will be all joining us. And we're really excited for that. You can register there. And we also have two special events in October. One is a roundtable on psychoanalysis in the Chinese diaspora, which is co-hosted by Nancy Da and Amy Wong. And Jane will be back for that. We're really excited for that as well. That's on October 30th. You can register for that here. And then we also, on October 8th, will have a roundtable to celebrate Donald Moss's new book, Psychoanalysis in a Plague Year, and he'll be joined by TJ Clark. And you can also register for that here. Our mailing list, which we send out seldom, we don't spam, will also be sending out notice of these events. And the fall is going to be an exciting time for us. In a few weeks, we'll launch the website for Parapraxis, and we'll start accepting subscriptions to our print magazine. And this winter at the foundation, we'll be offering short courses and a certificate program in psychosocial studies. So you can always sign up, as I said, for our mailing list, or you can follow us on Twitter here. Okay, so I'll get out of the way now just to say thank you so much for joining, and to our illustrious, amazing speakers, all three of whom are not just appearing here today, but have variously made the field of psychosocial thought, and all of whom have generously donated their time and names to Parapraxis. And we're so grateful to the three of you. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jane, who will be introducing our speakers and the topic at hand, melancholy. So Dr. Jane Hugh is a celebrated critic and scholar who lives in Los Angeles, my former Bay Area neighbor before we both moved. She teaches at the School of Critical Studies at Cal Arts and is an assistant editor at M+1. Jane recently received her PhD from the Departments of English and Film and Media at UC Berkeley, where she completed a dissertation entitled Generic Asians. Her scholarship has come out from so many places, including textual practice, modernism and modernity, Victorian studies, modern fiction studies, and Verge. Her public writing has appeared in equally as many places, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, Harper's, Book Forum, and many others. So thank you so much for being here, for our speakers, for agreeing to join us, and to Jane for moderating. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Hannah, for that introduction and for inviting me to moderate today. And of course, thanks to our esteemed panel, Professors Anne and Lynn Cheng, David Ang, Ranjana Khanna, and thanks to all of you here for joining us. So sort of just to reiterate, Hannah, welcome to what I think is the third installment of the Psychosocial Foundation and Parapraxis magazine's conversation series. And the concept or keyword, as it's been referred to, of our conversation today is on melancholy, right? Which for many is typically associated with Sigmund Freud's foundational 1917 essay titled Mourning and Melancholia. So I'm going to give sort of a brief definition of it here, drawing from Freud's essay as part of my brief preliminary remarks before I introduce our panelists and we can launch into the discussion proper. Okay, so in his essay, Freud famously, understands mourning and melancholia as correlated, or as he frequently describes it, as analogous affects, but crucially different. He famously distinguishes the nature of melancholia from what he calls the normal affect of mourning. And here in one of my favorite Freudian run-on sentences, he gives, quote, "The distinguishing mental features of melancholia are a profoundly painful dejection, cessation of interest in the outside world, loss of the capacity to love, inhibition of all activity, and a lowering of the self-regarding feelings to a degree that finds utterance in self-reproaches and self-revilings and culminates in a delusional expectation of punishment," period. The sentence that immediately follows is, he's aware of the bloated definition. So he says, "This picture becomes a little more intelligible when we consider that all of these traits, right, are also found in mourning, except with one exception, which is that of the disturbance of self-regard. That's absent in mourning. So in contrast, mourning is the normal or the regular reaction, as he calls it, to the loss of a loved one, or to the loss of some abstraction which has taken place of the loved one, or another sort of concept or object, such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, and so on. So, with that in mind, I wanted to just sort of start off by posing, why is melancholia 100 years and a few years later worth thinking about and theorizing, or indeed re-theorizing? What is our attachment to melancholia? And is it melancholic? And what might it be to think of melancholia as a specifically psychosocial phenomenon or affect, rather than perhaps merely a psychical one? What happens when the melancholic pact takes up social forces as its object, and contemporary social forces in particular? Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speakers and then sort of hand it off. Anlin Chen is a professor of English and affiliated faculty in the program in American Studies, the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Committee on Film Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of The Melancholy of Race, Psychoanalysis, Assimilation, and Hidden Grief, Second Skin, Josephine Baker and the Modern Surface, and most recently, Ornamentalism. Her writing can also be found in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Huffington Post. David L. Eng is Richard L. Fisher Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Program in Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is also Professor in the Program in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, and the Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. In 2016, Eng was elected an honorary member of the Institute for Psychoanalytic Training and Research in New York City. And in 2021, he was awarded the Kessler Prize from the Center for LGBTQ Studies, which is given to a scholar and or activist who has produced a body of work that has had a significant influence on the field of LGBTQ studies. Eng is author of Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation, on the social and psychic lives of Asian Americans, co-authored with Shen-Hee Hong from Duke in 2019. The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, and Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America. He's co-editor with David Kazanjian of Loss, The Politics of Mourning, and with Alice E. Hom of Q&A, Queer in Asian America. His current book project, Reparations and the Human, investigates the relationship between political and psychic genealogies of reparation in Cold War Asia. And last but not least, Ranjana Khanna is director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, where she is professor of English, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and the literature program at Duke University. She serves as the vice president of the American Comparative Literature Association. And she works on Anglo and Francophone post-colonial theory and literature and film, psychoanalysis, and feminist theory. She has published widely on transnational feminism, psychoanalysis, and post-colonial and feminist theory, literature, and film. And she is the author of Dark Continents, Psychoanalysis and Colonialism, and Algeria Cuts, Women and Representation, 1830 to the Present. She has published in journals like Differences, Signs, Third Texts, Diacritics, Screen, Art History, Positions, SAQ, Feminist Theory, and Public Culture. And her current book manuscript in progress is called Asylum, there's two, Asylum, the Concept and the Practice and Technologies of Unbelonging. Okay, so thanks so much. And I think that Professor Cheng will start us off.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. And I love being in conversation with David and Ranji, whose work have, of course, been incredibly important to me over the years. And so I think it's gonna be really fun to have a conversation. So I'm very honored to be here. So I thought I would just talk briefly for about 10 minutes or less about the book that I wrote called The Melancholy Race, which I wrote 12 years ago. And it has really saddened me that much of what concerned me in that book are still or remain pressing today. So 12 years ago, I had felt it important to assert that the racialization and denigration of Asians and Asian Americans in this country is as deserving of critical attention and as integral to the vexed picture of American racial landscape and as damaging as the racialization and denigration of African Americans. Today, this reminder still seems strangely necessary, even as anti-Asian violence in the last couple of years has demonstrated the dangers of such elision. 12 years ago, I argued that we are a nation at ease with grievance, but not with grief. We still are. In the desire to move past racial troubles, in our eagerness to claim progress, we as a nation have been more focused on quantifying injury and shoring up identity categories than doing the harder work of confronting the enduring, ineffable, sometimes contradictory and messy wounds of American racism, how being hated and hating can look alike, how the lesson of powerlessness can teach not only justice, but also the ugly pleasures of power, how the legacy of anger, shame, and guilt seems to address, but in fact covers over the consequences of American racism and xenophobia. Back in the year 2000, I was concerned about the social, affective, and psychical afterlife of this illusion on the part of the racialized minority, on how we have mistaken the passion of grievance for the work of mourning. While I think this is still true, the last several years have also shown us the terrible rising of what we might call white grievance. In other words, we remain in the grips and are seeing the ever-widening ripples of a nation caught in the melancholia of American racial dynamics, a continual reprisal of grievance and counter-grievance. I am not a clinician, and I don't use melancholia as a diagnostic tool. I am not, for example, interested, nor do I think I'm qualified to label Asian Americans as melancholic. Melancholia, for me, represents a particularly powerful conceptual tool for understanding the peculiarities of American racial dynamics and the structures of feelings and the processes of identification that history has engendered. Freud's conceptualization of melancholia, or the melancholic ego, as something formed and fortified by a spectral drama whereby the subject sustains itself through the ghostly emptiness of a lost other, seems to me a very apt description of American racial relations. First, it is this peculiar and uneasy dynamic of retaining a denigrated but sustaining loss that resonates most acutely with the mechanism of racial imaginary as they have fashioned, right, in this country. That is to say, systems like segregation and colonization and colonialism are not ever about really getting rid of the racial other, but about keeping them in a particular useful but erased place, right? Racialization in America can then be said to operate through the institutional process of producing a dominant, standard, white national ideal, which is sustained by the exclusion yet retention of the racialized other. The national topography of centrality and marginality legitimizes itself by retroactively positing the racial other as always other and lost to the heart of the nation. Legal exclusion then naturalizes the more complicated loss of this unassimilated racial other. Second, Freud's notion of this very uncomfortable sort of taking in, or what I think of as a sort of an uneasy swallowing of the racial other, and its implication for how that loss gets processed and is secured as an exclusion, lend provocative insights into the nature of the racial other, seen as the, quote, foreigner within America. In a sense, the racial other is in fact quite assimilated into, or more acutely, most uneasily digested by American nationality. The history of American nationalism, American national idealism, has always been caught in this melancholic double bind between incorporation and rejection. If one of the ideals that sustained the American nation since its beginning has been its unique proposition that all men are created equal, then one of America's ongoing national mortifications must be the history of its acting otherwise. While all nations, of course, have their repressed histories and traumatic atrocities, American melancholia is particularly acute because America is founded on the very ideal of freedom and liberty whose betrayal have been repeatedly covered over. Even as the economic, material, and philosophical advances of the nation are built on a series of legalized exclusions of African Americans, Jewish Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and so forth, Native Americans, long list, and the labor provided by those excluded, it is also a history busily disavowing these repudiations. And we pay the price of that repudiation or that disavowal again and again. Most recently, for example, the so-called big lie is not about the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election. The big lie, I think, is a belief in the racial purity of American origins and the myth of a white exceptional supremacy that had given ideological cover to the long life of Western settler colonialism. That imagined history was created and has been preserved through violent systemic erasure, aided by the painstaking craft of race making, from how certain immigrants became white to how others become, quote, Oriental, and all the accompanying expulsions, right, alongside of this process. Dominant white identity in America thus operates melancholically as an elaborate identificatory system based on a psychical and social consumption and denial. The races need to develop elaborate ideologies in order to accommodate their action with official American ideals. Think about all the so-called patriotic rhetoric that was rehearsed by the January 6th mob, for example. Those who do not see the problem, or those who call themselves unideological or non-ideological, are in some ways more melancholic of all of us, I think. Because I think in today's political climate, as Toni Morrison famously said, quote, "It requires hard work not to see," end quote. Melancholia thus offers a powerful tool precisely because it theoretically accounts for both the guilt and the denial of guilt, the blaming of shame and omnipotence in the racialist imagination. The racial minority too, though, also partake of this melancholic structure. And I always find that when I talk about melancholia and the race subject, that I have to begin by saying that it does appear tremendously difficult and maybe uncomfortable to talk about the melancholia of racialized people, especially since it seems to reinscribe a whole history of affliction or run the risk of naturalizing the pain. But it seems to me even more damaging not to recognize the race subject's relationship to this structure, this very, I think, national structure. For the dominant white culture, the racial other is the ghost in the machine. For the race subject, there is a kind of double melancholia at work, both the internalization of that lost white ideal and a constant confrontation with the self as that constitutive lost object, right? Does the person of color, when I say they're doubly melancholic, I mean that the person of color is both a melancholic object and a melancholic subject, at once the one lost and the one doing the losing. Even as we recognize how deeply uncomfortable it is to talk about the ways in which the racial minority is bound to racial melancholia as much as the dominant subject is, we must also see how urgent it is that we have to start to look at the historical, cultural, and cross-racial consequences of racial wounding in this country and to situate these affects as crucial formative elements of individual, national, and cultural identities. Only then can we begin to analyze how racialized people, to understand racialized people as complex psychical beings and how they deal with the objecthood that has been thrusted upon them and to which extent not largely constitutes how they negotiate both sociality and nationality. I had taken this quote from Robert Frost as one of the epitaph to my book 20 years ago. And this is a quote from Robert Frost. Grievance is a form of impatience. Grief is a form of patience. End quote. So the question I think that we have today is, do we have the patience to look beneath the politics of racial identity to the ongoing and undergirding history of American racial entanglement? Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much, Anne. I wanted first to start by thanking Khanna, Zivan, and Jane Hu for organizing this panel. And I want to say, like Anne, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with both Ranji and with her. I've learned so much from both of your work. Jane, you started the session by asking why melancholia? And I think simply the answer to that is because we are still overwhelmed with unprocessed loss today. And melancholia really, in my mind, is one of the most sophisticated paradigms for analyzing past and present losses that remain unmetabolized by ourselves and by the larger society. When Khanna wrote us and asked us to talk about melancholy for 10 or 15 minutes, I thought that what I would do is try to give a genealogy of the concept in my thinking and to try to walk you through the ways in which I discovered the process, discovered the concept, worked with the concept, and the ways in which it's evolved for me in the more contemporary moment. So Anne and I were in graduate school together. We were in Berkeley, as I like to say, in the Cheng dynasty, although it really wasn't that long ago. It was about 25 years ago. And we were all collectively working together with a group of fantastic psychoanalytic thinkers and mentors who were thinking about melancholy. And those include Judith Butler, Kaja Silverman, Leo Bersani, who just sadly passed away, and Nancy Chodorow. And I think that what made our collective especially compelling is that many of us were thinking not just about the individual, but the social bases of loss and the ways in which the social made certain losses difficult, if not impossible, to mourn. So throughout my work, I've always approached psychoanalysis not as an individual dynamic, but as a social one that's embedded in a wider world of collective political relations. When I received notice and was asked to join the board of Parapraxis, I was thrilled just because of the absolute emphasis on the question of the psycho and the social. And I would say that in my most recent book, Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation, my co-author Shinhee Han and I described this approach as the imperative always to consider the history of the subject in relation to the subject of history. Indeed, Shinhee and I argue, our subjectivities exist in the space where the history of the subject and the subject of history come together. Another way of putting it is that we cannot think about the mother without considering the motherland. We cannot talk about family dynamics without talking about the family of nations. And I don't need to remind this audience that psychoanalysis as a discourse is a colonial one, and it emerges in the context of colonial modernity, which is a topic that Ranji explores so beautifully throughout her work. So let me return to Berkeley and talk about two historical issues in my coming of age during my graduate studies there. And these two historical issues were, it was the height of the AIDS pandemic in the US, and it was also the tail end of civil rights and what I might describe as the start of a relentless battery of legislations and propositions that tried to roll back the gains that people of color, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and immigrants had made in the post-war period. So let me talk about AIDS first. So I went to actually graduate school largely because I had come out and decided that I needed to be in the Bay Area. And when I got there, I encountered a number of thinkers who were trying to grapple with our inability to mourn an entire generation of young gay men who were dying and who were not being publicly acknowledged. And as Judith Butler points out, a loss that cannot be publicly mourned is a life that retroactively was not worth living. And that if loss cannot be publicly affirmed, then it turns inwards as melancholy and depression. And this might be a topic of conversation for us later in the discussion, which is the idea that when the death drive turns inward, it's singular, and that is about the berating of the self, which is all over Freud's essay. But when it's collectivized and turned outward, it becomes something, that death drive becomes something which we might call the mania of war. And certainly in the wake of 9/11, that was how I began to historicize and think about the process. So the cure to this melancholy and depression was the need to externalize the loss. And here the aesthetic becomes so important. And I think about something like the AIDS quilt, which was a group of individual and unacknowledged losses of young men, and the ones who were mourning them, they stitched panels. I guess I'll just rehearse this because I know they're all different generations on this Zoom conference. This was a quilt where the various patches of the quilt had names of the dead young men, their lovers, their friends, their family, stitched together the panels into one big quilt, which was then displayed publicly, among other places, unfurled on the lawn of the White House. And this, I think, is a perfect example of the way in which individual and unacknowledged losses are stitched together into contingent whole for the public display of grief, in the words of Douglas Crimp, as both a mourning and a militancy. So let me turn to the second historical moment, which is the rollback of all of these civil rights gains, the rise of ethnic studies, and the introduction of critical theory for the rethinking of racial identity in general, and Asian American subjectivity in particular. And this is where I think Anne and I's work really is very much in sync with one another, where we were using melancholy to think about the losses that attach to racial identity and the ways in which things like processes of immigration, racialization, assimilation, losses associated with language and culture, unbelonging and belonging. The loss, as Anne says, of not just Asian Americans as subjects, but objects, or maybe translated the loss of Asianness and whiteness for the racialized subject. These are all losses that emanate from the social in the history of Asian American subjectivity, these are losses that are a result of a series of legislation and other legal instruments that were meant to keep Asians out of the country, to prevent them from reproducing, from gaining citizenship. And in this sense, the source of melancholy was not, as Freud insisted, an individual pathology. It was insistently a collective and social pathology. I went on to think after graduating from Berkeley about the concept intellectually, and that resulted in a co-edited anthology that I worked on with another Berkeley colleague, David Kazanjian. And that anthology is called Lost, the Politics of Mourning, that Jane referenced. And this is a collection of 26 essays that consider the politics of loss, melancholia, and mourning, from Asian American topics, from Asian American immigration to AIDS, to Armenian genocide, to South African apartheid, to the history of Irish famine. And I think in those days, it was really the days of big, fat anthologies. We can't do that anymore. But if you're interested in the ways in which that concept grew, I would push you to look at that anthology, which came out in 2003. But clinically, I began to write a series of co-authored essays with Shin-Hee Han, who is a Korean American psychotherapist that I met in my first teaching job at Columbia in the wake of a spate of suicides by Asian American students. And the book that eventually became Racial Melancholy or Racial Dissociation really began with one particular suicide, a young woman named Shirley Yoon, who was a junior who had spent her year abroad in Paris, and she was just back that fall as a senior at Columbia, and she committed suicide in broad daylight by jumping out of her dorm window, a 17th floor dorm window. And Shirley was very popular. She had a lot of friends in the community, and they came to her funeral. And her funeral had, hundreds of students. But Shin-Hee and I and the campus chaplain were, in fact, just a handful of administrators who showed up for her funeral. And this really struck us that there was something deeply
No, Roscoe.
I think somebody's mic is on, probably. Okay, so there were so many Asian American students at Columbia, but it was as if their losses and their mourning did not have a public life. And I offer that example just because I think it underscores the way in which Asian American, there was a form of an interdiction on mourning for the Asian American students. So the concept became increasingly personalized for me from the time of AIDS to thinking about racial identity, to actually beginning my career teaching in the field and being the only Asian Americanist. I was the only Asian Americanist at Columbia at the time. Shin-Hee was the only person of color in counseling and psychological services. And so it became really a kind of day-to-day ethical engagement with the concept, because simply when I look back on my time, this was 20 years ago with Shin-Hee, we were witnesses, right? We were witnesses to this interdiction on mourning and rethinking very systematically the question of melancholy in the space of the classroom and the clinic was a calling, it was an imperative on our part. And so we published in 2000 an essay in a clinical journal called A Dialogue on Racial Melancholia, and that was 22 years ago. And now in 2019, well, we gathered a whole set of essays that we've written subsequently on the classroom and the clinic, and that's Racial Melancholy or Racial Dissociation. So I'm just going to end today by talking about the historical evolution of my thinking from what the book title is, Racial Melancholia, to Racial Dissociation. And what I'll say is that these are not changing, these are not universal and unchanging concepts. They have to be rethought, and they are historically contingent in terms of a constantly shifting social landscape. And for me, and I think for Shinhee, the classroom and the clinic have always functioned as a social barometer for the changing patterns of immigration, racialization, and assimilation that we've witnessed in our spaces, our different spaces in the university. And the book is comprised of 4 chapters. The first chapter begins with an exploration of melancholy, the model minority stereotype, and suicide. The second chapter is about transnational adoption, because simply about 5 years later, more and more of the students in my Asian American Lit and Culture class would be coming out to me not as gay or lesbian, but as transnational adoptees. Though, of course, they borrowed the language of stigma and shame from queer studies. And then another 5 years later, we noticed that more and more of the students and patients were no longer second generation Asian Americans. I think when Anne and I were in college, invariably, if you were Asian American, you were most likely second generation, meaning that your parents were immigrants and you were born and raised in the United States. I would say the 50-50, or maybe even almost a majority of my students now are first generation, and many of whom are parachute kids, kids that are sent away at a very young age, often on their own, abroad to Western speaking nations for educational opportunities. And so we began to write about transnational, parachute kids, transnational parachute kids. And then the final chapter of the book is about the politics of coming out in our so-called colorblind age. And so I'm going to end by just talking about returning to the subject of history and the history of the subject. So in terms of the subject of history, what we've seen across the 4 chapters of our book is really a movement from thinking about Generation X, my generation, to Generation Y. And historically, we've also, as I said, moved from an era of civil rights to a formal era of legal colorblindness. How has this affected what Shinhee and I call the history of the subject? We argue that it moves us in terms of loss from paradigms of what we call melancholy to paradigms of dissociation. And clinically, I would put it this way, which is when students in my generation, Asian American students, or actually students in general, would show up in the clinic, the largely manifesting condition would be depression. And today, when students show up in the clinic, the large manifestation symptom is panic, anxiety and panic attacks. And so the difference between melancholy and panic, you could say also, is that panic attacks are a full-blown psychosis. And psychoses, you feel like your body's falling apart, and the only thing you can do clinically is try to prevent a student from harming themselves. And so it's a very, very difficult condition to address. There are many ways in which Shinhee and I talk about this phenomenon and try to think it out historically and theoretically. And what I'll do is end by suggesting that in part, the emergence and reification of social media is, in fact, a dissociative experience for everybody, right? Even right now, we're on Zoom, and I'm in my office, some people are in their homes. The inside, the outside, the space of the home, the space of work are completely confused. You can be distracted and doing one thing and being on Zoom on another. So just the very structure of a highly mediatized and technologized world, the speed at which images move has really fragmented and broken up the kind of experience of self with self, self with other. And I think that that's one historical reason for the emergence of anxiety, panic, and dissociation. But the other, I would say, in relation to Asian Americans, is that the social contract for them, and this returns to something that Anne brought up in her presentation, we say in this book that the social contract for Asian Americans, in fact, is to be colorblind. That in order to be recognized, in order to be seen, in order to be rewarded, you must be colorblind, you must erase yourself and your racial identity, you must say you have no race, and that you're adjunct to whiteness. Such a social contract makes it exceedingly difficult to create a stable, or what Bromberg, who is one of the great theorists of dissociation, might describe as an adaptive form of dissociation, which is the creation of a stable illusion of meanness from the continuous fragmentation of our social and our psychic lives. So the key thing, of course, with Bromberg is that he says they're pathological and they're adaptive forms of dissociation. We're all dissociated beings. It's adaptive if you can create that illusion of meanness, and it's pathological when you can't. And this, of course, branches out into concepts such as false self that Winnicott writes about. And so for me, when I started to engage with these concepts in relation to the shifting patterns that I witnessed in the classroom and that Shinhee was witnessing in the clinic, each of these concepts just kind of, amazed me, because they described, I thought, to almost a T, some of the psychic maladies that Asian American students face on a day-to-day basis. For instance, Winnicott's idea of the false self as highly successful individuals who accomplish, who are agreeable, who do very, very well, often intellectually and politically, but feel emotionally empty. And so I think that I'm going to end my comments there, but I'm very curious to get to our conversation together. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And, of course, I've known Anne and David for a long time, and we have interacted, but we've never actually been in conversation about melancholia, even though we were all working, as David was saying, at a certain moment. Whereas whereas David and Anne were working closely at Berkeley, I was trained in the UK, and my understanding of melancholia was really shaped by feminist psychoanalysis and post-colonial psychoanalytic thinking that was emerging at the time in the UK. And so really I came to psychoanalysis through a critique of it, through a critique of it that really was much more than a criticism of it. It was a critique that in the sense that we could think that nothing can simply be taken as a given, no text or artifact exceeds itself, that there's a concern with truth content in the psychoanalytic method, even as it might be criticized by its shortcomings. And so my attempt to think psychoanalytically and specifically with the concept of melancholia really came out of an attempt in Dark Continents to think about how psychoanalysis was a colonial discipline. As David just said, this is something that's been of concern to me all through my career. But that we would still, and maybe not but therefore, we would find it useful in the understanding of colonialism and its aftermath, the modern nation state, the forms of neocolonialism that follow on from that. Now, those are all very large ideas, of course, But I suppose I have wanted always, with my understanding of melancholia, to try to think through why psychoanalysis more generally is interesting for the study of the social, and why melancholy in particular. Now, there's a way in which one could think of melancholia in Freud in relation to its in relation to into what comes before it. Of course, melancholy is a term that predates psychoanalysis, predates psychology, one might say, and is developed through thinking that is often understood in relation to utopia as well. And I bring that up because for me it was always important to consider whether there could be something positive that emerges from melancholia. And I want to just sort of put that out there, that the melancholic is bound, as I understand it, through Freud's work, to a form of what I would call a desubjectivation, an impoverishment of ego, a critical agency that sees the world as poor, but actually acts in a way that is destructive to the self as well. Whether there is something in that critical agency that can actually find a way, indeed, of interpreting and seeing the world, which is not only a misapprehension, which is not only displacement of world onto self, as it were, in a form of self-criticism. So I suppose, for me, there have been sort of two tracks in psychoanalysis, in psychoanalytic thinking, that have been important. And I just want to sort of say a little bit about those different tracks, because I feel that it would provide a way of understanding why, as a literary scholar, I found one more interesting than the other, ultimately. Now, I became very taken with the work of Abraham and Torok, and I know that Anne also was at a certain moment too. And their use of the concept of introjection, which they take, of course, from Sandor Ferenczi, the process by which in fantasy the subject transfers objects from the outside into themselves, right? I became very interested also in the way in which Carl Abraham takes that up, adding this idea of incorporation, where something is not fully taken in to the self, that gets taken up by Melanie Klein, by Lacan, and I think along that track also in the work of Judith Butler, when she is talking about, for example, in her book, The Psychic Life of Power, the ways in which there is a giving up of a polymorphous perversity, a giving up of a bisexuality at the moment in which one comes into one's ideas, I suppose, of one's own sexual desire. And then there's another track, I think, that starts again with Ferenczi, goes through Freud, where he takes together those ideas of introjection and incorporation that then get taken up more explicitly in Abraham and Torok, where Introjection is understood more like a kind of healthy morning, as it were, where something is fully digested, a loss is taken on, fully digested into the self. So introjection on the one hand, and then incorporation on the other, where the loss is stuck in the throat and results in that oral metaphorics, results in a different form of language emerging, results in what they also call at various moments a demetaphorization in language, which is the taking literally of what makes sense only metaphorically. I became very interested in this form of thinking because in many ways the way in which one is asked to attend to the forms of telling in a sentence, the forms of linguistic form as well, perhaps bilingualism and polylingualism also within that kind of form. Also, I think draws attention to something that was then taken up by Jacques Derrida, to consider the ways in which there is never a full morning, right? He talks about something following Abraham and Torah called mid-morning, and I don't think that was just trying to be cute. I think it was really to talk about the ways in which there are only degrees by which one can introject, and that an introjection is never full. And in many ways, this idea of a remainder that then comes up in Derrida's thinking becomes the source of thinking more broadly. It becomes the source of unhinging a truth, as it were, and allowing a concern with how truth content begins to be told. And so it was that possibility of thinking of the remainder, which is a kind of critical agency, as a way of opening up the possibility of something else. And that something else is always an unknown, right? We know from Freud that the unlike the mourner, the melancholic is usually largely unaware of exactly what the thing is that they've lost, right? And that's the case whether it is a person, a loved one, or an idea, or an ideal indeed, that's in play. So this thinking of critical agency as potentially something that opens up the possibility of an understanding of the world that isn't only debilitating became very very important for me. And it was also, I have to say, the point that I was that I am consistently engaged on when I talk about dark continents, this sort of insistence that maybe melancholia opens up the possibility of something else, even though we know that there is an impoverishment of ego that comes along with it, even though that there is a desubjectivation that takes place. That is not only a desubjectification, which is about, just to sort of clarify that opposition I'm making there, desubjectification is more of a kind of epistemological idea where one might undo the training, the thinking, the perhaps brainwashing, the processes of creating hegemony, that one lives by, the forms in which one might resist the ideological state apparatus, to pick up on Althusser's ideas. So there's that idea on the one hand, whereas desubjectivation is in many ways more troubling, right? It is about an impoverishment of ego that is about the dissolution of the subject, right? How is it that one can actually talk about something which is the unlivability of desubjectivation on the one hand as something that carries the kernel of the constitution of a new form of being, right? And one could think about this as, how is it that one learns to enjoy one's symptom, as it were, that one creates a way of being through it, or one could think of it as trying to find a way of tolerating what is intolerable. And I take that idea from Sarah Kaufman, who talks about looking at Rembrandt's painting, The Anatomy Lesson, and the physicians or the physicians in training who are surrounding the corpse and looking at it, and she talks about this form of intolerability. So that possibility of something emerging that could be positive out of melancholia is something also that I more recently, I suppose, wanted to go back to, because I think it is, even for me, one of the more challenging forms by which I was trying to consider the relationship between psychoanalysis and colonialism, and the possibility of a critical agency that could open up things. And I suppose, more recently, I've gone back to an essay that precedes Mourning and Melancholia, the two essays actually, written in March and April 1915, published as Thoughts for the Time on War and Death by Freud, that provide an understanding of group affiliation on the scale of the national, or something even larger than the national. He doesn't use the word global, but he is thinking in global terms, through the process of increased disappointment and disillusionment on behalf of a we that also challenges the possibility of the continued existence of that we, imagined as a people represented by a government, right? In Thoughts for the Time on War and Death, he's basically talking about how the body bags that return home in a time of war, the mass death that is witnessed at that time is the occasion at which there is massive disappointment and disillusionment. And so, in some ways, I've been trying to think about this relationship between disappointment and disillusionment, but disappointment on such a massive scale that actually the we that Freud is discussing there, the we of the cultured nation states, the we of the civilized nation states, not the colonized people, right, are massively disappointed because something is revealed about the hypocrisy of the world, the hypocrisy of the nation states that profess peace only to actually do something quite different. And what he says, and I just want to actually sort of put this out there because it's a moment that actually returns me to the question of colonialism. He says peoples are more or less represented by the states which they form, and these states by the governments which rule them. The individual citizen can with horror convince himself in this war of what would occasionally cross his mind in peacetime, that the state has forbidden to the individual the practice of wrongdoing, not because it desires to abolish it, but because it desires to monopolize it, like salt and tobacco. A belligerent state permits itself every such misdeed, every such act of violence, as would disgrace the individual. It makes use against the enemy not only of the accepted ruse de guerre, but of deliberate lying and deception as well, and to a degree which seems to exceed the usage of former wars. The state exacts the utmost degree of obedience and sacrifice from its citizens. So you know, this is an essay that moves from the collective we to the individual in the later part, and then in the second essay, and the effects of mass death on conceptions of individual death as well. But it's a moment too in which world war and mass death in world war actually opens the possibility of understanding through that astonishing disappointment, the disillusionment and the dissolution of the we, and then perhaps also the individual in relation to identification with a nation, because there is the understanding that the social contract is built not on creating peace, but actually using the state of nature, the violence inherent in that, and monopolizing it, much in the way in which that was done, of course, during colonialism for salt and tobacco. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. That was really such an enlivening and enriching conversation. And I'm sure that not only do the panelists have a lot that they might want to say to each other, but also the participants of the Zoom talk today, I'm sure, do have questions too. So just to give a quick update, it's Pacific time, it's 11:05, or it's 5 after the hour. So we have, I think, 25 minutes left. So I might just, open it up with a few, not even more comment than question responses to these talks. And then maybe after that, either the panelists can speak to each other or we can open it up. But yes, if anyone has questions, Hannah, I'm not sure if you would prefer the raised hand option or use the chat. Okay,
used for you.
Yeah.
Jen.
Okay, cool. Great. So, all of the talks I felt were really resonant with each other, but sort of two things that maybe for me really drew them together sort of conceptually was first, I was sort of noticing with Anne and David in particular, and then also Ranjana towards the end, the way that you were concluding and sort of beginning actually your intellectual biographies or genealogies around questions of temporality, right? So Anne kind of ends with this question of whether we have enough patience, which is interesting because the way that Freud understands mourning is that there's enough time, which is a little different, right, than do we have enough collectively patience to work through what still has not been worked through. And for David, you sort of concluded with this shift from depression to dissociation, or something like panic, which you describe as full-blown psychosis. And interestingly, that's also how Freud ends that essay. He thinks about mania as a different kind of narcissistic explosiveness, right? And is panic mania, or is panic related to the mania of war, or what is the relationship between just like implicitly panic as a mode of working through or feeling down now, and do we have enough patience? And these questions seem like not just are we running out of our own psychic resources, but are we even structurally, do we have sort of enough time? So of course, this sort of brings me to broader looming questions of like, is climate change melancholic? What isn't in our current era of very, very late capitalism? And Ranjana, for you, it seemed like I was really interested in how you framed the shift from disappointment to disillusionment as a shift in scale, right? A shift of the we. But of course, it also seems to be a kind of retroactive temporal shift too, right? Sort of belated recognition or realization or acceptance or conceding. And something there about kind of the mid-morning or the compromise or ambivalent space brings me to something else that I was really excited that you brought up, Ranjana, which is about, is there something critically positive or just, productive about melancholia? Whenever I read the Freud essay, I'm reminded of theories of paranoia, which are, incredibly intellectually, epistemologically, right, productive. They're good at making meaning. They also uncover as much as they sort of disappear, right? And that's sort of the productive tension that Anne was bringing out at the beginning. So yeah, I was sort of, curious, from the other speakers too, what is positive, or what's the critical agency of the melancholic mode, or something like the remainder, right? And again, just sort of only because I reread it this morning, the Freud essay, I forgot that he has this moment where he talks about like truth, right? And he sort of says like the melancholic guy, he's down on himself, he's telling you all how much he sucks. And that's when he's pretty near to understanding himself. But why? We wonder why a man has to be ill before he can be accessible to a truth of this kind, right? So he's not right, but he's not wrong either. And I feel like that's also descriptive of the paranoid or the hysteric, right? Like we all know they're kind of onto something. And that brings me just to my last point, which is, you mentioned, Ranjana, this critical potential also of desubjectification, which I feel like is related to something like the social, right, the collective. And I was thinking about, when you were talking about that, how Anne and David in particular were sort of implicitly describing their work as about the national collective, or the general experience of the social in America in particular, right? The sort of the American nation and let's say late 20th century to the contemporary shifts in rights, law, policy. But of course, haunting, or not even haunting, just, there too is against or beside the general experience of the American National Social. It's also the specificity of the Asian American, right? Which is also, it seems, and I really liked how both Anne and David talked about this, like a kind of de-specified, de-subjectified force as well. Like how the social contract for Asians or Asian Americans of legal colorblindness is both a seeing and a not seeing, right? And that there seems there to be some kind of general insight, or I don't know, critical, right, mode that seems to also be related to the potential, right, the intellectual, political potential of the sort of mid-morning of melancholia. Okay, so I'm just going to, you do not need to address any of those. I just was putting those out there to kind of collect what I saw as themes, and then, yeah, I'm gonna mute. Yes, Anne, sorry.
I'm not listening to Raj and David, and so much of what they said and what Jane just said. I just have some really quick responses. One is, I didn't think Freud was that patient, right? I think that his idea of mourning is precisely that it's finite in nature, as he says. And melancholy is the one that drags on forever, right? But I think there's something in that dragging on forever that actually may be productive. And this sort of leads me to this Ranji's very wonderful questions about productiveness and melancholia. I was thinking about so many things. One, that paranoia, the intimacy between paranoia and perspicacity for a racialized person is both a paradox, but also so vital to their survival in the world. Thinking about the invisible man, being not, on a street confrontation with this white man, and then he, they got into a fist fight, but the invisible man is the one who started it. And we actually can't tell if it was going to be racial or not. So he was both paranoid, but also very smart, right? Of course, it was going to be racial. So there's that sort of intimacy between paranoia and perspicacity that I think is both productive and a paradox, right, for the racialized person. Very quickly to your question about why do we have to be ill in order to know the truth? I think one answer is, what Freud and Judith Butler has done a beautiful job pointing this out, that, the interesting thing about Melancholia, that essay, is that he starts out by saying these are two different things. There's a healthy version and here's a pathological version. And by the end, it's, there's actually this very forceful suggestion that melancholia is a fundamental structure for ego formation. So, so he actually does end up saying you do have to be sick in order, to know, right? And then finally, I was thinking about, I too am, constantly thinking about the productiveness of melancholia. I think a lot about what does it mean to survive as an object? What does it mean to live as an object? And I was thinking about how all the writers that I have been really, that I dwell with a lot are oftentimes authors who have given us these sort of melancholy pictures in which there's no doubt that the force of social that gets internalized is incredibly oppressive. But at the same time, it is in that negotiation with the oppression that you see the complication of what agency really means, right? Like we think of agency as a willful act, but it is in those moments of oppression, it is in those moments of where you have nowhere to turn that you actually see, I think, alternative modes of agency, of subjectivity. It is actually in crisis that those moments emerge. And I'm just very quickly thinking about, Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, where a little Black girl just wants to be like, to have blonde hair, blue eyes, or in Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior, where there's a scene in the bathroom where the Asian American schoolgirl is abusing another girl, Asian American girl who looked just like herself. And those are moments of like terrible internalization, right? But there are also moments of weird, agential and subjective formation that are not easily recognizable, but I think are really important to accommodate, right?
Yeah, David, thanks.
Jane, I just wanted to also, like Anne, respond to some of the issues that you raised. And the first thing I'm just going to say is, when Ranji was talking about reflections upon war and death, I've often thought of those two essays, one published in 1915, Mourning and Melancholia, published in 1917, as almost two sides of the same coin. And what I would say is that in the first essay, it's almost like an editorial. It's an editorial really about his loss and disillusionment with European Enlightenment. And he talks about the disillusion of Western man as the fact that Western man has lost any ethical relationship to death, right? This is the war, World War I. He writes it in the wake of that, in the midst of it. And says that this is the invention of weapons of mass destruction, the massive loss of civilians, machine guns, mustard gas. And so you press a button and all these people die. And he says, there's no, Western man has lost all ethical relations to death. And I really think of that as a collective process. And I think of mourning and melancholia as an ethical exploration, not of death, but also of loss, right? What kind of relationship will we have to loss? And I had said earlier in my presentation that I thought of the death drive, and what you were saying about turning inward or turning outward as melancholy versus mania, precisely as death drive turned inward is melancholy, it's singular, death drive turned outward is mania, the mania of nationalism, the mania of total war. And I think that's one way to think about the individual versus the collective. This really comes from my current project on reparations, but I wrote that I put in, when Ranju was talking, a quote from Reflections Upon War and Death that I use in an essay called Colonial Object Relations, which I published in 2015. And I think that what Anne just raised about the insight of melancholy is really about if, at the end of the day, Freud inadvertently or advertently deconstructs the relationship between mourning and melancholy, and that all subject formation is based on these losses, right, that are never fully mourned, never fully recognized. Those are, Judith Butler's reading of gender melancholy. Then the real issue becomes that if all of our egos are formed in relation to these unacknowledged losses, why are some objects more valuable, and why do they have the social support around forfeiture and loss that other objects don't? And that really is the bridge into the question of object relations and Melanie Klein, and the paradox really not that reparation, it's not that you aggress an object and then you repair that object, and that's a good versus a bad object. The very act of reparation creates the dividing line between the objects that you consider valuable and reparable and the objects that you don't consider valuable and irreparable. And so the paradox really that I think Melancholia brings up is, how do you repair a bad object? How do you repair devalued objects that nobody would care for? And I think that's where you get the insight of the melancholic, because at least for the racial subject, you are holding on, for instance, to a mother tongue, a mother language, your mother, right, that has no social value, who's devalued, right, that's socially unaccepted. And you as the melancholic have a kind of stubborn hold, persistent. This is where the question of time comes, and you're not going to give up that devalued object. And I think that that's where the insight comes in. I think the last thing I'll say is that you yourself mentioned, how do we think about melancholy in the age of climate change? Many indigenous scholars have thought about that. And there's a whole, in indigenous studies, there's a whole movement called ecological grief, ecological mourning. I'm thinking about the work of Ashley Kunslow and Neville Ellis, where they describe ecological grief as the way in which climate-related issues and losses of species, of ecosystems, of landscapes, how that opens up into contemporary paradigms of grief that were always there, because the long history of colonial object relations is a history that is embedded in the question of racial capitalism and the extraction of natural resources.
Thanks. That's both really interesting responses. I wanted to just bring up this question too, again in Freud, about the thing that we don't know that we've lost. Because I find this a very sort of important and compelling point in terms of the temporality of loss as well. If we don't know what it is we've lost, and therefore can't fully introject it, perhaps we can never fully introject anything, because there's always some aspect of it that we don't know that we've lost, as I think David was just saying, and I think Anne was also just sort of saying, the importance of the sort of what we would anachronistically perhaps think of as a deconstruction of the essay that Freud brings about himself. This question of not knowing is also there. It's not only that the subject seems to know, to never have been more knowledgeable about herself in Melancholia. There's also this question that goes along with it, that the melancholic doesn't know what it is exactly that's lost. It may be, on the one hand, a partner, but then what is it about something in the partner that they don't know, that they don't know that they've lost? Or the same with an ideal. What is it? So, in some ways it's somewhat, it's, I think that for me, that question raises a slight complication to this idea of loss being a part of sort of normal development, right? As it were, the subject comes into being through these series of losses, and because in many ways they may come into some kind of sense of being through these series of losses, that in a sense, because the biggest loss is the loss of being, right, as it were. I mean, in that sort of, a kind of non-psychoanalytic sense, as well as a kind of Sartrean sense, as well as a Lacanian sense, one might say. It's not necessarily a psychoanalytic idea, but if it is the case that we don't know what it is that we've lost exactly, can we sort of think about this as part of the developmental process in the same way than we can if, say, we think, okay, well, we gave up that aspect of a desire that we can recognize that we gave up. So that would just be a question that I have in relation to what David was just saying. I'm sort of curious about this. I think it's a question that I would want to pose to Melanie Klein in some way, but in the absence of Melanie Klein, I'm going to ask David to take a stab at it. Then also just briefly on the question of time, I do think that the time periods are of course fascinating in Mourning and Melancholia, and if it stops at this, after a couple of years, then you're just fine, and if it doesn't, then there's another sort of problem going on. I do think also that in so I'm going to insist on the translation of the title of the 1915 essay as Thoughts for the Time on War and Death, because in the German, Thoughts for the Time is Zeitgemäße. So it is indeed, time is built into the title. It announces temporality also through the idea of a kind of mass and congregation, if you like, right? That idea of Zeitgemäße is both time on the one hand and a time of being that is about a congregation, right? So it's about the we, right? So one could say that idea of Thoughts for the Time on War and Death is already about thoughts of how we might imagine ourselves in time and death. So I just sort of want to put that out there, because I think that the thoughts for the time is different from reflection, which is more of a visual understanding of thinking, as it were. But it's also, on the one hand, it's saying how we think now, but it's also about a kind of temporal unfolding of coming to understand or lose our understanding, perhaps more accurately, of what it means to be a global subject, right, in a time of war where disappointment is ruling the day.
David, do you want to take up the mantle of Melanie Klein and try to?
I mean, I can try to answer Randy's great question. Maybe Anne has some thoughts about this quickly. I know we're coming toward the end, and I see there are actually a whole number of very interesting comments in the chat. But I do think that the question, Freud says that these are unconscious losses, and you often know who you've lost, but not what it is in them that you've lost. And I think that that dynamic, I would just illustrate a kind of response to that dynamic as something that is not individual, but actually collective, which is to say that if the unconscious is opaque to us, we know, as clinicians, as therapists, that it can only emerge in a series of translations, right, to the subject. And I think of translation as a profoundly intersubjective relationship. It's necessarily so. I think all of us are complete natures. So here, I just really, again, go back to the space of both the clinic and the classroom, which is what I say to my students, that when I'm teaching them Asian American history in my Asian American literature class, I begin by asking simply who's ever read an Asian American novel in high school, who ever learned about internment, what did you, how much space was devoted to something like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad or its connections, to the rise of the internet and two forms of Asian labor that go into the greatest, pieces of technology of the 19th and the 21st centuries. And even today, going back to Anne's comment, there's surprising paucity of knowledge around those topics. And so when I teach these topics to the students, and I always, again, emphasize these larger histories in relation to the history of the subject, students often get many, many feelings, right? It's transformational, not just on the level of knowledge production, it's transformational on the level of their own subjectivities. And I say to them, when they're struggling, that this is to be expected, because this is actually about both learning, but in a way it's also about therapy, right? Which is, it's giving them a critical vocabulary and a history to re-narrate themselves. And maybe that's one way of thinking Ranji's question of where do we think about the translation of that opacity or the unconscious nature of the lost object in Melancholy. We rethink it collectively as a series of speculations around the meaning of what that opacity might take in the re-narration of your history to yourself.
Thank you. So it looks like we are
in the chat some answers.
yeah, I don't know.
Very slow typing, so I just
Yeah, I mean, Hannah, what do you think? Should we end? There's one, I think at least one question that Anne's been.
Yeah, and if you want to voice what you've been typing, and then everyone will have gone around twice, that would be lovely.
Okay, I'd be quick. I would just that there was a great answer about Asian Americans. Why do they overachieve when they are melancholic objects, and what do white people expect them to? And my answer was that I think that white racist thinking about Asian Americans has always included, denigration, but also utilitarianism, right? So that Asian Americans are always supposed to be useful, productive, helpful, but disposable. And not that creative and not that interesting, right? This is the whole coolie mentality thing. And Susan Fisk, the psychologist, has a very famous experiment where she asked a bunch of people what they thought about Asian Americans on two axes. warmth and intellect. And just as you might expect, everyone thought the Asian Americans score very high on intellect, but very low on warmth. So they are basically, they're smart, but not likable, right? So that's sort of the outcome of that test. But what I think is interesting about that test is not the result, which is totally predictable, but it seemed to me extremely revealing that the two axes of question is intelligence and warmth, so that I feel like the test already sets up a certain kind of assumption about Asian Americanness. And as for why Asian Americans themselves feel the need to achieve, I think it's a fantasy of reward. It's a model minority. It's a model minority myth, right? Which is that if you work hard, you will get somewhere. But what you encounter, I think, is what I think of the colonial mimicry, which is the demand to be, yes, you should always be like us. You should always work really hard to be wonderful like us. But in the end, you can never be, right? So I think that for Asian Americans who encounter that disillusionment, which usually happens, I think, with age, right? All my students think that they can achieve anything they want as long as they work hard. All of them think that. But oftentimes I meet Asian American alums who then tell me, I never realized that there was a bamboo ceiling, and so forth. But finally, the last thing I want to say, though, just because I think it's important, is that, David, I want to tell you that this past year, there were 4 suicides on Princeton campus. All 4 of them were Asian American students. And somehow nobody seemed to notice that, at least not at the university institutional level.
So I just want to say that, a good 2 decades after what you saw at Columbia, we're still looking at the same things. I'm sorry to end on such a sobering note.
No, it's appropriately melancholic. Thank you so much to our, wonderful panelists for the really enriching conversation, and Hannah, Stephen, and Alex Colston for bringing us all together. I think you may just leave. I think now we are a few minutes after time, but yeah, thank you so much again. And
Thank you all.
Do you guys need us to stay on, Jane and Hannah and Alex?